the idea of Paul mentioning that Eden or paradise is in the third heaven, and that Paul knew somebody who was actually taken up to the third heaven. So what we're going to do tonight is we're going to look at the evidence that supports this claim and talk about why this is not integral, but is part of the mythicist arguments. I have references in the description if you would like to go and look it up. This is concerning 2 Corinthians 12, 2 through 4. This is an authentic Pauline epistle. If you guys don't know, Paul has 7 epistles that are authentic, and then there's a few that are not. This comes from, this author we know as Paul. This is, of course, a New International Version, but it's pretty similar in all of the other ones. I know a man in Christ who 14 years ago was caught up to the third heaven. Whether it was in the body or out of the body, I do not know. God knows. And I know that this man, whether in the body or apart from the body, I do not know, but God knows, was caught up to paradise and heard inexpressible things that no one is permitted to tell. As we can tell, it is definitely mentioning that a man in Christ, meaning a fellow Christian, who was taken up to the third heaven and heard inexpressible things. Now, paradise in Christianity, especially Paul's understanding of Christianity, paradise is Eden. The same Greek word that Paul uses here for paradise is the same word used in other works at the same time as Paul to indicate paradise. Also, in the Septuagint, it describes Eden as paradise using the exact same Greek word. Normally, I don't like using the Septuagint to validate what Paul says, but in this case, it's quite interesting that Paul is using the same word as the Septuagint when they're both describing paradise here. It's definitely that paradise is Eden, and there is this first century understanding that paradise is in the third heaven, which is what it says right here, the third heaven. You can actually be taken up there by God. That's what it says. And we'll get into some of the source criteria for validating that this is actually what was being said in Paul here as we progress through James McGrath's analysis, I guess, of this particular section. Essentially, the cosmology understood by not only Paul and first century Christians, but also Jews at this time, was that heaven was a physical place. It contained different layers to it. The higher up you get in heaven, the more spiritual you are. So like the incorporeal beings, they were higher up in heaven. So like God is in the seventh heaven, where Jesus is supposedly sitting right now as this spirit person, I guess, or this incorporeal being there in the seventh heaven and everything like that. As you descend through the heavens and you get all the way to the firmament, which would be the lowest parts of heaven, the firmament being that the firmament is this solid dome that's over the earth, you lose that incorporealness. It's inhabited by corporeal beings, most notably like Satan, his demons. We even have record of this outside of Paul as being a general idea of not only Jews, but also Christians. So Satan and his demons were living in the firmament of the heaven. And how this is not integral, but part of the mythicist argument. The minimal mythicist argument says that Jesus was a pre-existent incorporeal being at first, and then God fabricated a body for him, created this body for him out of Davidic sperm. Then Jesus descended, this Christ figure descended and took on this mortal body to suffer, die, be buried, and then ascend back up into heaven. So what this shows right here is that the paradise that is known in Genesis and to these first century Christians was actually in the third heaven. And where this connects with the rest of mythicism and Christian thought is that Adam was actually, not only Adam, but also it was Adam, Eve, and Abel. All three of them were thought to be buried in the third heaven, which is where they were created. So to these individuals, they thought of Adam as initially a divine figure, because that's divine figures inherit what were inhabiting the heavens, including the lower heavens. So like Satan and his demons, those were divine beings. Adam initially started out as a divine being. And then when they disobeyed God, God threw them out of paradise down onto the earth, where they banished to because they disobeyed God, right? That was part of the fall of Adam and all this other stuff. Where this factors in is that if we as mythicists are going to say that Jesus was buried in the heavens, it that is the case, then there should be evidence of this elsewhere in not only Christianity, but also Judaism, because all of this is derived from Judaism. So do we find this? Yes, we do, in this idea that Adam is buried in the third heaven. When Adam dies on earth, not only Adam, but also, like I said, also Eve and Abel, they were all taken up by God. As we'll see, specifically, God has Michael, the archangel, take them up into heaven to be buried where they were fashioned, which is in the Garden of Eden, in paradise. That's where Adam is buried. To kind of orient yourselves to how our cosmos is actually sort of structured, the third heaven is either located at the same level as either Venus or the sun. It's not like a heliocentric model that you got to think about with this. What you got to think about is a geocentric model, because that's the model that they had. They thought that the earth was the center of the entire universe. Obviously, the planets were emanating out from the earth. It's either Venus, because the Venus is actually known as the morning star, right? So it's either Venus or it's the sun itself is the level at which the third heaven is at. So that means that Eden could quite literally have been considered to be on the sun, because they didn't know how the sun worked at that time, right? They just saw bright light and we can't see anything, so therefore Eden, I guess. We don't really know which model that they had in mind when they were talking about the third heaven. Paul doesn't give us any kind of indication. There's no indication given in our source material. So we don't really know which kind of like layers to heaven that they had in mind, but it was either Venus or the sun. And this is all found in the mainstream scholarship concerning the cosmology of the Jews. No, well, not just Jews, but also Christians. Eden was definitely located in the third heaven. We have multiple sources for that, which we'll get to in a minute. But all of this is integral to the Mythis Hypothesis, or it's part of the Mythis Hypothesis, because this proves that Jews would have believed in somebody dying and being buried in the lower parts of heaven, and specifically the firmament, because Adam was buried farther up the chain than the firmament in the third heaven, the third layer of it. It seems like there would be no issue for these Jewish Christians to also consider Jesus to have been buried in the heavens. It's that very specific part. We're laying the foundation for Jews accepting this idea because they already believed in similar ideas. So this is not something that's crazy. This is not something that's just fucking out there. This is recognized by academics studying the field. Like literally, I had talked to Carrier about this, and he literally spent 10 minutes on Google Scholar and came up with, no joke, 5 to 7 scholars that were citing this idea in some kind of way. I'm going to show y'all some of those sources here in a minute. But I just kind of wanted to get y'all sort of oriented to the discussion that we're having, how it's important to the mythicist position. Now, remember, you can't be anachronistic about this. And this is important because of how James McGrath is going to answer this. You can't sit there and have a modern concept of cosmology. You can't have a modern understanding of like what heaven is. Like, you have to orient yourself to a first century Jewish Christian mindset. Okay. That's very important in any of these discussions, because that's one of the biggest problems that I see people making, is that they're anachronistic about their interpretation of this kind of stuff. So let's see what James McGrath has to say.